for there are places that exist in the shadows of the world, places that should never be found. Thomas and his family were about to stumble upon one of these places, and it would become their worst nightmare. They had been driving for hours along a lonely highway, the rain pouring down in relentless sheets, when they decided to pull over at a rest stop. The rest stop was eerily quiet, shrouded in mist, with only the dim glow of a flickering streetlight illuminating the area. Thomas, his wife Camilla, and their two children, Kevin and Maria, stepped out of the car, relieved to stretch their legs. The air was heavy with moisture, and the scent of wet earth filled their lungs. As they approached the small, run-down building that housed the restrooms, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Something about this place was wrong. The windows were fogged up, and the door creaked ominously as he pushed it open. Inside, the rest stop was dimly lit and eerily silent. The fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically, casting unsettling shadows on the cracked, dirty tiles. Camilla took the children to the restroom while Thomas walked around, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. Suddenly, a strange noise echoed through the building. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through Thomas. He turned towards the source of the sound, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out before him. As he continued walking, Thomas noticed something disturbing. The hallways seemed to stretch on endlessly, looping back on themselves, leading him in circles. No matter which direction he took, he always ended up back where he started. Panic began to rise within him as he realized he was trapped. Meanwhile, Camilla and the children were having their own unsettling experiences. The restroom was cold and damp, with an overwhelming sense of dread filling the air. The children clung to their mother, sensing that something was terribly wrong. When they tried to leave the restroom, the door wouldn't budge. Camilla pushed and pulled, but it remained firmly shut. The flickering lights above them grew dimmer, and the whispers that Thomas had heard now filled the small space with an eerie, disembodied presence. Back in the main hallway, Thomas frantically searched for his family. The walls around him seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. His heart pounded in his chest as he called out their names, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Just as Thomas was about to give up hope, the hallway shifted. The walls twisted and contorted, revealing a door he hadn't seen before. With no other options, he pushed it open and found himself in a room that defied logic. The room was filled with old, tattered furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught Thomas' attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was cracked and dirty, but something compelled him to walk towards it. As he gazed into the mirror, Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. Reflected in the glass were his wife and children, standing behind him with vacant, lifeless eyes. Their faces were twisted in expressions of fear and agony, as if they were trapped in some eternal torment. He spun around, but the room was empty. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The rest stop wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a prison for lost souls. And now, he and his family were its latest victims. Desperate to escape, Thomas ran back into the hallway, the walls closing in around him once more. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with terror. He knew he had to find his family and get out, but the rest stop had other plans. As he rounded a corner, he saw them. Camilla, Kevin, and Maria, standing at the end of the hallway, their eyes still empty, their faces twisted in fear. But as he ran towards them, the hallway stretched farther and farther away, the distance between them growing impossibly long. No matter how fast he ran, he could never reach them. The rest stop had them now, and it wasn't going to let them go. The last thing Thomas saw before the darkness swallowed him was his family, reaching out for him, their faces frozen in a silent scream. And then there was nothing. The rest stop remained, silent and waiting for its next victims. For those who pass by on the highway, it's just another place to stop. But for those who enter, it becomes the last stop they'll ever make. There are roads we travel, believing they will lead us somewhere safe, somewhere familiar. But some roads are traps, leading us deeper into the unknown. And once you're on them, there's no turning back. Jonathan found himself on one such road late one stormy night, when he took a wrong turn that led him to a bridge. The rain battered his windshield, the wipers working furiously to clear his view, but it was no use. The darkness was thick, the road barely visible under the relentless downpour. Jonathan's headlights caught a glimpse of a sign, "Bridge ahead." It seemed like salvation, a way out of the winding, desolate road he had been driving on for hours. As he approached the bridge, the road narrowed, and the trees on either side gave way to the vast, open expanse of the river below. The bridge loomed before him, old and rusted, stretching into the darkness. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, his gut telling him something was off, but the thought of getting home pushed him forward. The moment he crossed onto the bridge, he felt a strange shift. The air grew heavier, the rain seemed to intensify, and the sound of his tires on the wet pavement echoed eerily in the silence. He drove slowly, the bridge seemingly endless, with no end in sight. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. Jonathan kept driving, but the other side of the bridge never came into view. Panic began to creep in. He checked his watch, but the hands were frozen, as if time itself had stopped. He glanced in his rearview mirror, hoping to see the entrance of the bridge, but it had disappeared into the darkness. It was as if the bridge had swallowed him whole, trapping him in this endless stretch of road. The rain began to pound harder, and Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just the storm, playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, he knew this was something far more sinister. His car's engine began to sputter, the dashboard lights flickering ominously. Jonathan's heart raced as he pressed the accelerator, but the car seemed to be losing power, struggling to move forward. It was as if the bridge itself was trying to stop him. In a desperate attempt to escape, Jonathan floored the gas pedal, but the car jerked and shuddered, coming to a complete stop. The engine died, leaving him stranded in the middle of the bridge. The only sound was the relentless rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Jonathan tried to restart the car, but the ignition clicked uselessly. Panic surged through him as he realized he was trapped, alone in the darkness, with no way out. The bridge stretched on endlessly in both directions, offering no hope of escape. Suddenly, the rain stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive, as if the world itself had ceased to exist. Jonathan's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. That's when he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the bridge, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. But there was something undeniably menacing about its presence. Jonathan's first instinct was to lock the doors, but his hands were frozen, paralyzed with fear. The figure began to move towards him, slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, helpless, unable to move or react. The figure drew closer, and as it did, Jonathan could make out more details. It was not quite human, its body twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. Its eyes glowed faintly, filled with malice, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Jonathan knew he had to get out. He fumbled with the door handle, his fingers trembling. The door creaked open, and he stumbled out into the cold, wet darkness. The figure was only a few feet away now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Jonathan ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from the bridge, away from whatever nightmare had taken hold of him. His footsteps echoed on the wet pavement, the sound blending with the distant roar of the river below. But no matter how far he ran, the bridge never ended. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, the air thick with fear. He could feel the figure's eyes on him, could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, as it followed him. Jonathan's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he couldn't stop. The bridge stretched on, infinite and unforgiving. He was trapped in a loop, a never-ending nightmare with no escape. The figure was always there, just behind him, waiting for him to falter, to give up. But Jonathan couldn't give up. He kept running, even as his strength faded, even as the bridge seemed to stretch on forever. The figure was always there, just a step behind, its malevolent presence a constant reminder of the terror that awaited him. In the end, Jonathan's fate was sealed. The bridge that never ended had claimed another victim, trapping him in its endless darkness. And as the rain began to fall again, the figure smiled, knowing that there would always be another lost soul to chase, another victim to claim. There are roads that seem to exist outside of time, where the past bleeds into the present and the dead refuse to rest. Charles, Alice, Jason, Jeffrey, Nora, and Lily were about to discover that some highways are more than just a path from one place to another. They had been driving for hours, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desolate road ahead. The highway stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. The air inside the car was tense. They had all heard the stories about this stretch of road, a place where travelers experienced strange visions, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. But they had dismissed it as just another urban legend. As night fell, the mood inside the car grew more somber. The conversation dwindled, replaced by a heavy silence. The darkness outside was thick, pressing in on them from all sides. The headlights illuminated only a few feet of the road ahead, and the world beyond seemed to disappear into an inky void. Suddenly, the temperature inside the car dropped. The air became cold, unnaturally so, and the windows fogged up despite the heat being on. Charles, who was driving, glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at him. He slammed on the brakes, causing everyone to lurch forward in their seats. The car skidded to a stop, and they all sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Charles' heart pounded in his chest as he peered into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Alice, sitting in the passenger seat, turned to Charles with a concerned look. He tried to brush it off, blaming it on fatigue, but the unease in the car was palpable. They all knew something was wrong. As they resumed driving, strange things began to happen. Jason, sitting in the back, let out a gasp as he saw a face pressed against the window, pale and lifeless, with eyes full of sorrow. He recoiled in horror, but when he looked again, the face was gone. Jeffrey, next to him, began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. He could hear faint whispers, as if someone was trying to speak to him from just beyond the veil of reality. The voices were soft at first, but they grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with a chorus of despair. Nora and Lily, sitting in the very back, clutched each other tightly. They both felt as though they were being watched. As the car continued down the highway, the visions grew more frequent, more terrifying. They saw shadowy figures standing by the side of the road, their faces twisted in agony, their hands outstretched as if pleading for help. The car passed through them as if they were made of mist, but their presence lingered, oppressive and suffocating. Charles gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with fear. He could feel the weight of the road pressing down on him, as if the highway itself was alive, feeding off their terror. He wanted to turn back to escape this nightmare, but he knew there was no going back. The further they drove, the more the world around them began to change. The road seemed to stretch out endlessly, curving in impossible ways, leading them deeper into the unknown. The landscape became a twisted reflection of itself, with trees that loomed like dark sentinels and shadows that moved on their own. The voices grew louder, more desperate. They were no longer just whispers. They were screams, cries for help, from souls long lost to the highway. Charles could hear them in his head, could feel their anguish as if it were his own. Then, without warning, the car's headlights flickered and died. The darkness swallowed them whole, and the car came to a shuddering stop. The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with tension. They were stranded, alone on the highway of lost souls. The road behind them had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, and there was no way forward. The dead were all around them now, their presence undeniable. Charles tried to start the car, but the engine sputtered and failed. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The figures outside began to move closer, their forms becoming more solid, more real. They were coming for them. With no other options, they decided to leave the car and make a run for it. But as they stepped out onto the cold asphalt, they knew it was already too late. The highway had claimed them. The dead surrounded them, their faces full of sorrow and despair. Charles could feel their icy breath on his skin, could hear their mournful cries. They were trapped in a loop of terror, lost on a road that led nowhere, with no hope of escape. And as the darkness closed in, they understood the truth. The highway was a bridge between worlds, a place where the dead roamed freely, searching for the living to join them in their eternal torment. They had become the latest victims of the highway of lost souls, and their fate was sealed. Some roads are meant to be avoided, places where reality bends and nightmares come to life. Benjamin and Hannah had no idea they were about to find one of those roads, guided by a GPS that seemed to have a mind of its own. They were on their way back from a weekend getaway, the sun setting behind them as they drove through the countryside. The drive was supposed to be straightforward, a simple route home, but as darkness fell, the GPS began acting strangely. It directed them to take a turn onto a narrow, unmarked road that neither of them had seen before. The road was not on any map, and the surrounding area seemed unfamiliar, despite being close to home. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to follow the GPS instructions. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by thick trees that seemed to close in on them as they drove. The further they went, the darker it became, with the trees blocking out what little light remained. As they continued, the air grew colder, and a dense fog began to roll in. The headlights barely cut through the thick mist, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Hannah started to feel uneasy, a sense of dread settling in the pit of her stomach. She suggested they turn back, but the road was too narrow, with no space to turn the car around. Benjamin tried to stay calm, focusing on the road ahead, but his hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly. The GPS kept directing them further down the road, its voice mechanical and unfeeling. The fog grew thicker, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of civilization in sight. After what felt like hours, they came across an old, dilapidated sign that read "Dead End." The sight of it sent a chill down their spines, but the GPS insisted they continue. The road grew rougher, with potholes and cracks that made the car jolt with every bump. The trees on either side of the road twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Suddenly, the car's engine began to sputter, and the headlights flickered. Panic surged through Benjamin as he tried to keep the car moving, but the engine finally gave out, leaving them stranded in the middle of the dark, foggy road. The GPS went silent, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Hannah's heart raced as she looked around, her eyes straining to see through the fog. She could have sworn she saw shadows moving among the trees, but every time she looked directly at them, they disappeared. The air grew colder still, and the sense of dread intensified. Benjamin tried to restart the car, but the engine refused to turn over. The fog was now so thick that they couldn't see the road ahead or behind them. They were completely alone, with no way to call for help. Desperation set in as they realized they were trapped on a road that shouldn't exist. Suddenly, they heard a low, ominous sound coming from the fog. It was a deep, rumbling noise, like distant thunder, but it seemed to be getting closer. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the trees swayed violently, as if something massive was approaching. Hannah gripped Benjamin's arm, her fear palpable. The rumbling grew louder, and the fog swirled around them, forming shapes that seemed almost human. The figures in the fog became more distinct, their faces twisted in pain and anguish. They reached out towards the car, their mouths open in silent screams. Benjamin and Hannah were frozen in terror, unable to move as the figures closed in. The car was surrounded by the ghostly apparitions, their eyes empty and hollow. The temperature inside the car plummeted, and their breaths came out in visible puffs. The figures pressed against the windows, their cold, lifeless hands leaving frost on the glass. Just when it seemed like the figures would break through, the GPS suddenly came back to life. Its voice was distorted, crackling with static, but it gave one final instruction: turn around. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He turned the key in the ignition, and miraculously, the engine rolled to life. He slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching as they sped backwards down the road. The figures in the fog receded, their anguished faces disappearing into the mist. The fog began to lift, and the road ahead became clearer. They drove faster and faster, desperate to escape the nightmare they had stumbled into. Finally, they saw the familiar sight of the main road ahead. As they merged back onto the highway, the fog vanished completely, and the GPS returned to normal. Benjamin and Hannah were shaken, but they were safe. However, as they looked back, they saw that the road they had just escaped from had disappeared entirely.